At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP12. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 26 Carter. It was hard being someone you were not. But it was also difficult to accept who you truly are. Although once you fully accept who you are, everything is easy, right? Perhaps, but Carter wouldn't know. Not yet anyway. Right now, he didn't want to think about who he truly was. Right now, he just wanted Yuta back. It was all he could think about over the weekend and ever since that. His wounds had mostly healed, and only a couple of bandages remained plastered over Carter's face and neck. Although no bandage would ever plug the bleeding in his heart. His heartache was like the music of a great orchestra. At times it was mellow and allowed him to reflect, and at other times violins would play, and he would drown in the sorrowful melody. Right now there was a rise to the crescendo, and anguish burst from his chest in a desperate shout. As Carter slammed his locker door shut, a whiz of air ruffled his silver hair and he noticed that Yuta had rushed past him. He clutched his black gym bag and stomped towards the pool room, shoving past the scurrying students that scattered his path. No, Carter thought, knowing exactly what he was about to do. Gloom crept into his soul like rain droplets into bare timber. It seeped into his pores, traveling to his heart which thumped morosely. He blinked back tears, hung his head and stared at the ground. Yuta had boosted his spirits and elevated his being. He lifted Carter out of his former bland self, like a diver rescuing a drowning swimmer. Now the loss of Yuta sunk him deep into the bottomless ocean that is his soul. Carter returned to his old self and had to start all over again. The sudden thought of returning to his old self caused disdain to pulse through him. The thought of having to start all over again caused a bitter taste to form in his mouth. The thought of a life without Yuta deeply terrified him. Carter jerked his head up and sucked the exuberant atmosphere, replacing it with courage. He decided that he needed Yuta back in his life or else it would be too late. He didn't care if it made him the most selfish person in the world. He did not want to give away the person he needed the most. No one wants to let go of the things they need the most and the things they will need in the future. Isn't that what the sole purpose of being human is? A creature who can't survive without depending on another one of their kind. Yuta! He called, chasing him around the scampering of students that littered the hallway. Yuta heard him but didn't look back. Instead, he hugged his gym bag against his chest and rushed towards the pool room. Yuta, please. Don't do this. Carter urgently yelled, ignoring the perplexed looks he was receiving from the students around him. Yuta pushed the gray door open with his shoulder. No. He simply shouted in response, stomping towards the change rooms. The door slammed shut in Carter's face, and he groaned with irritation. He swung the gray door open with an intense heave and trailed after the boy. The moment Carter stepped inside the pool room, the chlorinated smell of urine knocked his senses. He chose to dismiss the repulsive smell and instead glanced at the water flowing freely in the rectangle-shaped pool. The water shone like a molten mirror, with lights dappling upon its surface. It had lost its turquoise shade due to the gray ceiling of the school, but in the limelight, the murky ripples twisted. It was all the invitation he needed to dive in and leave his troubles bobbing on a swim ring above. Carter shook his head and suppressed the urge to jump in. Right now, he needed the calmness of the frigid currents to prepare him for his confrontation with Yuta. Yuta entered the change room first and slammed the door shut behind him again, a sign of his annoyance. Carter could tell Yuta did not want him chasing after him, but he entered the humid change room anyway. He turned the corner and saw that Yuta was already packing his swimming equipment. He angrily tossed his items into his black gym bag, which was resting on the benches. Yuta, please don't do this. Don't quit the swim team. Carter pleaded, his white eyes glassy with remorse and his voice ringing with anguish. Yuta furiously shook his hanging head, his black hair mopping over his eyes and shaking swiftly. You should have thought about that before you called me an idiot. He retorted, roughly stuffing his swimsuit into the depths of his bag without care. Carter inwardly groaned with frustration. Although he was not irritated with Yuta, he was angry with himself. Carter stepped forward and tried to get Yuta to face him. I didn't mean it. I swear. There was something wrong with me inside, no? Yuta snapped, looking up and glaring at Carter, who just inches away from him. His scrawny hands curled around the tough fabric of his bag, clenching with anger. Carter winced as his body twisted halfway to face him, and his neck craned in a slightly malicious manner. You can't use the paranormal activity as an excuse. Yuta fired back. Carter raised his eyebrow. What was happening to him during their argument wasn't any paranormal activity. It was just a hurricane of his emotions destructing all his senses. It was only after Yuta left that the shadow appeared. Unless it truly was paranormal activity the whole time and Carter was unaware. How would Yuta know then? Carter mentally slapped his forehead. He's just guessing and assuming. He only said that because he was in the heat of the moment. It's not a big deal, Carter desperately told himself. He urgently shook his head, hoping his sincere denial would gain sympathy from Yuta. I'm not. I just didn't know what I was saying. I'm sorry, Yuta. I really am. I don't believe you, Carter. How can you not know what you were saying? Your words really hurt me, Yuta spat as he shoved Carter backwards. Carter frowned and allowed him to, knowing he deserved it. It especially hurt because you were my first friend at my new school. I admired you a lot, but to think that this whole time you thought of me as an idiot. Carter quietly sighed, slightly relieved that Yuta didn't hate him as he thought. That relief didn't last long, as he realized that was before he snapped at Yuta. Now he screwed up immensely. Regret began to taunt him, with a jeering grin as it poked every part of his body that caused him discomfort. Yuta, I'm so sorry. It's just that. I thought you hated me. I felt like we were drifting apart ever since we became close with the others, especially Jessica, and that scared me. He explained, hoping that being honest would do the trick. Yuta stared at him with wide eyes. Usually when Yuta's pupils dilated, it was because he was shocked or amazed about some killer-diller swimming trick Carter did. This time, however, he wasn't in awe or stunned. His widened eyes had a sardonic glint to them, and Carter couldn't help but feel slightly intimidated by the black holes that were drilling into him. His eyes were so dark that it felt like Carter was staring into an endless stretch of the midnight sky. It was the type of twilight where the spooky witches would come out of their shadows and begin communicating with the devil, but that was just folklore. That's your reason. You were jealous, Yuta exclaimed through gritted teeth. Carter flinched at the slightly insane tone Yuta was using. Well, you're right, I didn't hate you. Didn't. Now I do. J'ai jaloux. No. I was just scared. Carter pointlessly defended himself. I'm sorry. Okay. I know it was stupid of me to think that. This was all my fault and I'm sorry, he desperately apologized, but Yuta raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Carter groaned and bit his lip, wondering what he could say to convince Yuta to forgive him. Please don't quit. You can hate me all you want because I know that I may have been selfish and a jerk to you. Just don't leave the team, okay? You mean a lot to the team. Especially because you were my last recruit. This grabbed Yuta's attention, although Carter wasn't sure whether that was a good or bad thing. His body completely twisted to meet his and he stepped forward, a dark shadow cast over his face. What? What do you mean I was a recruit? Yuta shouted with bewilderment. Carter slapped his forehead, and he didn't try to hide it this time. I'm such an idiot, he grunted to himself. He sighed and decided to tell Yuta the truth despite his mind being a panicked and confused mess. Well, I only started talking to you because I needed another member on the team. Wonderful, Carter. You're helping your case a lot, huh? Yuta said, infuriated by the fact that that was the reason Carter talked to him. Carter couldn't blame him as it truly was. It was selfish and greedy of him, he knew. But what else could he say? That he was partially interested in getting to know the new kid because he was attractive. He abruptly slapped his cheeks to stop from blushing. Now, seriously. He mentally scolded himself for instinctively thinking about how adorable Yuta was when he was angry. It was a deep contrast to how gentle he usually was, and it came as a shock to Carter. Although it also impressed him to an extent. He used language in the same manner an ice sculptor wielded a chainsaw, a blunt instrument used with such graceful precision. It was, much to his surprise, swoon-worthy. Well, what did you expect? For me to just randomly walk up to you without a reason? Carter scoffed defensively, hoping the awkwardness that was gnawing at his mind wasn't showing off in his exterior. He crossed his arms and tapped his feet against the floor, distracting his wandering mind. Yuta shook his head, his eyes brimming with frustrated tears. Seeing him on the verge of tears stained Carter with guilt. He knew that not even an apology would wash away the feeling. I thought you talked to me because you wanted to make me feel better about being the new kid, about being the only Japanese person in this entire greeby town. There was pain behind that shout, and it made Carter recoil, realizing Yuta had a point. I should have just lied and said that, he thought, groaning as the painful truth stung him. He should have known Yuta was like a fragile pane of glass. Carter noticed all the cracks, but he couldn't look inside his pain. He should have treated him with care and not shout unnecessary words that weren't even true. He always knew Yuta was suffering inside, but now it was visible on his face and he wished it would go away. The true Yuta was in that frozen glass. Carter knew it. The one that wanted this argument to be over with because he hated quarreling with his best friend. They both knew that arguing with each other was pointless because each of their responses was an emotional retort to the intention of the other's reply. Although they couldn't help themselves as they had to argue back. There was some amount of pride in every human, because of their individualistic desires and the lengths they would go to get there. Yuta, I really want you on the team. Yuta continued screaming, clutching the bag tightly to his chest. You know what, Carter? All you ever care about is yourself. You don't want me to quit because you need me on the team. You don't want me. Yuta's face brightened, just a tone lighter than his own crimson as their voices rose. Although Carter could understand Yuta's side, and he deeply apologized for that. I do want you, Yuta. I do. Carter hiccuped, the guilt in his churning heart hammering against his soul. His limbs began shaking because all he wanted was Yuta. He just wants him. Every part of his body knew, and now finally his mind accepted it. I want to make things right. Please let me. You don't have to forgive me right away, just let me try. Yuta scowled, although the rims of his eyes glimmered with some sort of far-fetched hope. Prove it to me then. Prove to me that you want me. Without any more hesitation, Carter grasped Yuta's head, swiftly slamming his lips against his and knocking all wind from his lungs. It was a sudden fiery urge his heart had been screaming to do. Perhaps it was his conscience wanting to comfort Yuta and his broken soul. It surprisingly comforted Carter too. His body had moved on its own since he couldn't contain himself anymore. It was quite a sloppy kiss because a rush of emotions was bombarding Carter's senses, but the world fell away nonetheless. One may even not call it a kiss at all, just a swift awkward graze of the lips in the middle of a heated quarrel. Yuta's tender lips were paralyzed in shock and unmoving as Carter gripped his cheeks. The bag Yuta had been clutching dropped the moment Carter abruptly pecked his lips. Both of their bodies were tense and stiff, as Carter had taken Yuta by surprise. Carter was surprised too, and he immediately regretted it once he realized that his lips were the only ones moving. He swiftly pulled away and stumbled backwards, a fierce blush spreading across his face. Carter drew shaky and shallow breaths as his mind replayed his embarrassing actions, subconsciously taunting him. They both stared at each other with wide eyes, but both were wide for very different reasons. Carter's was filled with instant regret as realization after realization struck him. To Yuta. A boy. He scanned Yuta's wide eyes that were filled with complete surprise. His lips were parted and the stain of Carter's lips touching his still lingered. An awkward silence hung in the air. It was a gaping void that needed to be filled with sounds, words, anything. Carter began stuttering, hopelessly searching through his mind for a way to go back in time and rectify his mistakes. He soon realized that unfortunately, time travel does not exist. Perhaps in the future, but not now. Although, it would be extremely helpful if it were to be suddenly created at that moment. Then, his respect for the world scientists would rocket to the sky. In a heartbeat, Carter would run to the nearest shop and purchase the machine without a second thought. He stammered, blinking as his impulsive actions seeped into every crevice of his being. Once again, regret began to poke and taunt him, like a younger sibling purposely annoying their elder because they are amused by their frustrated reactions. That was an accident, he gulped, averting his gaze from Yuta, who stood still with shock. I'm sorry. Please forget I ever did that. Yuta blinked in response, shutting his gaping mouth. Carter took that as an incredibly disheartening sign as rejection crashed against his soul, like an uncontrollable tsunami. He realized that there was some part of him that wanted Yuta to return his feelings. He knew that was a very sinful thing to think, so he tried to cover it up, as much as his heart willed him not to. "I'm deeply sorry, Yuta," Carter whimpered, biting his lip as the rejection swirled inside him. "See, that just happened. I don't know why. I'm really sorry," he apologized repeatedly, unsure of what else to say. Slowly, Yuta stepped towards Carter, gazing into his silver eyes with blankness. Carter gulped and sheepishly rubbed the back of his neck. Even at an embarrassing time like this, all he could think of was the closeness of his crush. "Jay, just forget everything, okay? I'll leave now. You can do whatever you want." "I'm sorry," Carter frantically said and turned to walk away, his heart sinking. "Carter," Yuta whispered, gently grabbing his wrist. Carter clenched his eyes shut and turned to face Yuta, hoping the floor would open up and swallow him whole. When nothing happened and Yuta didn't say anything more, Carter sighed. He fluttered his eyes open and prepared to give Yuta a lengthy explanation. "Yuta, that was... I forgive you," he simply said. It was at that moment Carter's clouded vision cleared, and he saw that Yuta's cheeks were dusted with pink. Carter's mouth was accustomed to frowning, so he forgot how to twitch his lips into a smile. The happiness he was feeling was internal. Joy flooded his heart at the sweet words Yuta's mouth sung. "He forgives me," Carter sighed with relief. Did he forgive me for what I said to him the other day, or did he forgive me for the kiss? He suddenly wondered, knitting his eyebrows at the unclarity of Yuta's answer. It was as if some fairy from the beyond raised her magical wand, because at that moment, a spell was cast on Carter. Time flowed slowly as they stared into each other's eyes. He noticed that there was a steadiness in Yuta's voice, as if all the storms were simply a whispering breeze to him. His eyes shone with blackness, like two pristine onyx stones, that stole Carter's breath away as they peered at him. His hair was an obsidian waterfall that tumbled with every gentle swing of his head. His hands that were wrapped around his wrist were strong but gentle at the same time. And his rosy pink lips. Carter thought he was dreaming or bewitched when Yuta leaned forward and planted a sloppy peck on his mouth. However, when he felt the realness of his soft touch, his eyes widened, and he suddenly understood. Yuta pulled apart for a moment, staring innocently into Carter's eyes, asking him if what he did was satisfactory. There was a childlike and uncertain glint in his handsome eyes, which only propelled the heat rising in Carter's cheeks further. Carter momentarily stood frozen, from both fear and excitement. He stepped forward to close the distance between them and responded with another peck, although this time he deepened the kiss. Carter eagerly swung his arms around Yuta's neck, his hand resting below his ear and his thumb caressing his soft cheeks. Their breaths were shaky as they pulled each other so close that Carter could feel Yuta's heart rapidly thumping in his chest. Warmth radiated on every spot that Yuta made bodily contact with him, causing his skin to tingle with pleasure. From his fingers that were hugging his waist and dancing along his spine to the lips that returned the kisses. In this warm moment of joy, his senses have been seduced and he can no longer think straight. With every push of his tongue, Carter's thoughts become obliterated, and for once in his life, no troubles were clouding his mind. He simply enjoyed the fireworks that erupted in his body as their lips crushed together. It was magical the way their lips fit perfectly. It was as if whatever divine being that created them purposely carved their bodies to connect. Or perhaps their souls were split in half during creation and they could not function without the other. His mouth was warm and wet, the caress of his lips softer than Carter could have imagined. "Yuta," he whispered slowly, prolonging each letter as if to savor them. Yuta smiled between their open-mouthed kiss, and Carter's heart fluttered like a butterfly. Carter loved the way his smile revealed his right dimple, and he caressed his thumb over the dent. Their kisses were soft at first but then became steep with desire. Carter's insistent mouth was parting his quivering lips, sending wild tremors through their nerves, evoking sensations the teenage boys had never known they were capable of feeling. Yuta's lips brushed his repeatedly, not innocently but fiery and passionate. Carter softly pushed Yuta to the ground, growing tired of standing. Yuta obliged as his shoulders loosened and he melted under Carter's touch. Carter held him gently, cupping his face with one hand and pressing his forehead against his partner's. Yuta was breathless with delight as he showered him with gentle kisses, each peck a flicker of warmth. Carter gazed down at him, thrilled beyond words to be the giver of Yuta's affection. He tilted his head to the side and kissed him, his lips demanding more room to enter. Carter felt a smoldering heat within him as his grip tightened, crushing his body against his, gentle yet firm. He slanted his head further, deepening the kiss. They both knew they were doing something really bad, but the taste on Carter's lips every time they kissed was something he couldn't get enough of. The sensible part of his brain told him to run, but the tiny smiles Yuta gave him told him to stay. So he drank every tempting part of him, savoring the sweet high that rushed through his veins with every blissful slurp. He couldn't get enough of their bittersweet love. Carter drew back from the kiss and spent a moment studying his lover's elated face. Carter was propped on his elbows and brushed his fingers through his soft hair, admiring every fine line of his delicate face. Yuta's blush deepened under his scrutiny, his black hair surrounding his head like a halo as it rested on the frigid change room floor. His mainly black appearance contrasted against the white ground, but his arms were spread wide with a youthful bliss that made him look like an angel. Carter pushed back his black bangs, revealing his soft forehead. He cradled him like he was a cherished baby and smiled at him, his heart surging with a warm euphoria. Yuta pursed his lips as he looked up at Carter and chuckled, his expression indescribably perfect. He didn't laugh like a man, he giggled as a boy and Carter loved it. It was like listening to his inner child jumping out. Yet everything else about him was all man, especially the muscular build that Carter's fingers were tracing over, underneath his sweater. His face was genuine in the way deeply content people are, lacking the tension anxiousness brings. Carter felt a little more lost and a little more at home each time they were together. While Carter gazed at him lovingly, his eyes softened with tenderness before sparking with something else. "What are you looking at?" "Kiss me," Yuta shyly said, grinning widely and tugging Carter's shirt playfully. As much as he wanted to continue kissing him, Carter couldn't will himself to ignore what he was seeing. He forced himself to lean down and enjoy the mirth of kissing Yuta, but his muscles wouldn't budge and his eyes couldn't avert. "What? Did I do something wrong?" Yuta asked, eyeing Carter skeptically. His pure smile turned upside down as he watched Carter's face go from lust to uneasiness. His breath got caught in his throat as the thing he saw increased in size. Carter wanted to spend more time with Yuta, laying on the change room floor, alone and lost in their own bubble of the world. He wanted to talk to Yuta and caress him like the other couples. He wanted to spill every secret in his heart and touch his soul as much as he desired. He wanted to create more happy memories with him, and hopefully be able to kiss him freely one day, without having to hide in the change room of their school. But he was suddenly reminded of the darkness of their world. Carter slowly peeled himself off of Yuta, untangling his legs that were locked around him. He staggered backwards while facing Yuta, his pupils dilated with pure horror as a cluster bomb exploded in his brain. Yuta sat up and knitted his eyebrows with concern. Before he could question Carter's shift in behavior, Carter screamed, "Get away from me!" He yelled, standing up as fear pulsed through his tremoring body. Yuta wore a pained expression because of those words, but Carter didn't have time to explain that he wasn't yelling at him. He couldn't breathe and it felt like someone was choking him. His heart was racing as the nerves in his body exploded with apprehensiveness. His primal flight instinct activated as he backed out of the hallway of the change room, wanting to leave as quickly as possible. "Carter," Yuta questioned, standing still with confusion. "Why are you leaving me?" he asked, frowning. "Yuta, run," was all Carter could muster the strength to yell. He pointed at the creature standing behind him. Yuta glanced over his shoulder, at the enormous shadow dragon that roared at Carter. At first, Carter had noticed it in Yuta's right eye. Shapes, lines and numbers had formed in the iris, placed in a sort of manner that Carter recognized. Slowly the shadow poured out of his eye and dripped to the ground next to his head. It shifted and sizzled into a tiny creature, then slowly grew into the big abomination that it now was. It was hard to believe that the monster standing before him was real. Dark scales that were as cold as ice blazed brightly like a flickering flame. In his chest, it appeared to hold a hearth of burning fire, although his hearth remained dormant for now. Just a simple glance at his beady eyes turned Carter's skin into a sickly pallor. His sharp talons clawed at the change room floor, that was able to lacerate even the sturdiest ribbons of flesh and bone. His blood was so black it held an intense radiance that could blind eyes. With his long curling tongue, he could smell a human's dread and taste their fear. He holds a pearl of wisdom like no other, and yet expresses toxic greed for destruction. His flapping black wings had holes and were jagged at the seams, and when it spread its wings it filled the entire room. Run away from what? Yuta asked, turning to face Carter with a perplexed expression. It dawned on Carter that what he was seeing was paranormal activity. Although the dragon looked like a harmless shadow with the appearance of flesh, it had a deadly glare that told Carter not to be deceived by its looks. Carter stood frozen in his spot, debating his options. The moment the shadow dragon roared again, his head jolted up and he urgently grabbed Yuta's wrists. He remembered that Jimmy had said for some reason when touching Yuta, his paranormal experience would disappear. So he gripped Yuta's hands tightly and pulled him forward. To his absolute shock, the dragon still stood there, and it looked like he was about to swallow Yuta in an instant. Carter gasped and hauled Yuta out of the change room. Paranormal activity, Carter urgently screamed, dragging him towards the door. Yuta's eyes widened with understanding and he ran alongside Carter, not wanting to slow him down. He put his faith in him and lurched forward, gripping the ends of his shirt tightly. Carter desperately opened the door of the room, only to be hit with something else. The knob wouldn't turn. The wall clock ticked like the timer on a bomb. He couldn't stop it, reverse it, or slow it down. Each tick dragged him forward, helpless and nervous to the allotted time they had left before the beast began stomping towards them. Carter wailed and slammed the door with his free fist, his heart hammering erratically in his chest as dread creeps into his mind. Damn it! Again! Carter yelled with frustration. Yuta gasped and quickly placed his hand on the knob, acting swiftly. It turned easily at his will and Carter glanced at Yuta with puzzlement. It was getting harder to tell what was paranormal activity and what wasn't, especially because Yuta seemed to only be able to cause some paranormal activity to die out. Although, the thought that perhaps the dragon was something that wasn't paranormal activity was more terrifying than anything else. Carter glimpsed over his shoulder and noticed the dragon trudging towards them. Its snout snarled into a sneering grin. The dragon was growing bigger and bigger by the second, and Carter did not want to know what would happen if it crushed them under his weight. He swiftly pushed Yuta outside as there was no time for pondering. He slammed the door shut behind him, knowing that would do little to stop the monster, but hopeful that it would give them some time. The two of them tightly grasped each other's hands and bolted across the wide pool room. Tears blinded Carter as they turned, running as quickly as their long legs could take them. The pounding noise of their scuffed sneakers resonating off the walls of the room matched his heart throbbing inside his chest with the thick fear he felt. His breath came in small spurts, anxious and afraid. At his sides, his pale fingers curled into sweaty fists, swinging forward as if it would make him faster. Behind him, he could hear the baying growls of the dragon. He tightened his grip around Yuta's hand, to comfort him but also himself. What's happening, Carter? I can't see a thing. Yuta panted, sensing the urgency of the situation. Before Carter could respond, the large dragon emerged through the enclosed change room, obliterating the wall. The sidewall crumbled in slow motion, slower than the eye can detect even if one filmed it and replayed it 1,000,000 times. Only the two boys could witness the steady deterioration of the abandoned cinder and slabs. Did you see that? The damn wall just broke. Carter shouted, pointing at the debris that was clanging against the ground. The dust of the crumbling rocks landed on their hair, and Carter's eyes were wide with alertness, dodging any heavy brick that fell above their heads. Yuta gasped and nodded, his eyes wide with horror. To him, it looked like an invisible ghost had suddenly destructed the wall, and Carter couldn't decide which situation was scarier. The wall breaking down by some unknown cause or seeing a monstrous beast plunge through the heavy debris. I can see the wall falling. What the hell was that? Yuta yelled, genuinely terrified. It's a damn dragon. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. A big black shadow dragon that will probably spit fire if we don't leave quickly. Carter exclaimed, pulsing faster. He was too focused on the exit on the other side of the pool room to notice that there suddenly was no one holding his hand anymore. The exit seemed so far away as his legs began to ache. Usually, during swim practices, Carter dreaded exiting that door. Now, he was desperately running towards it as it was his only safe escape. The dragon chased after them, roaring and enjoying the game they were playing. Carter wondered if the dragon could understand English, because then he would roar back at him and tell him that this wasn't a game. He debated on whether or not he would flip him off on top of that. Perhaps the shadow dragon wasn't simply a hungry beast. Maybe it has some sort of intelligence somewhere deep inside that thick skull. After a couple more intense sprints, he reached the door. At that moment, the dragon began spewing purple fire. The flames made contact with the water in the pool, but Carter was unable to see what happened. He made it to the other side at the right time and slammed the door shut as the violet-hued fumes covered the window of the door. Carter sighed with relief, thankful that the damn knob turned at his will this time. After the dust settled, Carter peered through the window and saw the dragon lying on the floor, dead. Its glistening obsidian scales stopped heaving, signaling to Carter that it was not breathing. He watched with furrowed eyebrows as the dragon slowly disintegrated, as if it was paranormal activity this whole time. The students around him noticed the broken pool room and its falling debris, but couldn't see the dragon that caused it. Some ran off to inform the principal, while others crowded the doorway, watching the dust and rocks tumble to the ground. What the hell happened to the pool room? A student to the left of Carter asked. Carter turned to his right, panting as he regained his composure. Yuta, are you okay? He asked, feeling relaxed in safety for just a second. His eyes suddenly widened as he came to a shocking revelation. Yuta wasn't beside him. Carter trudged the empty halls, his silver hair astray and dusted with tiny rocks. The lunch period was coming to an end, and he had spent the rest of it searching for Yuta. Unfortunately, he couldn't find Yuta anywhere. He even searched the pool room before the teachers told him to leave the area immediately. No, the dragon couldn't have burned him, he grimly thought. Carter turned the corner, coming to the hasty decision of informing the principal. As he passed the pool room that was now off-limits, he smacked his head, trying to remember the exact moment Yuta's hand left his grasp, but no recollection entered him. Slowly, grief surged with every expelled breath, always reaching higher peaks and never sufficiently soothed by his long intakes of the congested air. It was like a limb had been torn from his body without being given the chance to save it. Yuta was lost somewhere, and Carter couldn't see past the shadows that lingered in his mind. He clung to the hope that Yuta was still alive, and was unable to fathom what it would be like if he weren't. He shook his head and rubbed his watery eyes, leaving trails of sweat and dust on his cheeks. He missed the gentle brush of Yuta's lips touching his. Carter bit his tongue, remembering the feeling of Yuta's tongue swirling against his. His heart ached, feeling as if he had lost a piece of his soul. He missed being happy with Yuta, with his body pressed against his as electrifying waves coursed through him. It has only been an hour since his disappearance, and a cloud of depression already hung over Carter. He groggily trudged by a classroom, startled by the wooden door that suddenly opened. Out walked Mr. Stevenson, clutching a stack of papers. "Oh, hello, Carter." "Mr. Stevenson exclaimed, a jolly expression on his face. Carter forced a smile and began to walk away, but Mr. Stevenson continued speaking. "Have you heard that the wall of the pool room crumbled?" he asked, smiling a bit too widely during a dire school situation like this. Carter shrugged his heavy shoulders. "I've heard something of the sort," he muttered, leaning against the gray wall to support his trembling body. All he could think about was how Yuta was missing, and that he longed to travel his hand around his soft skin. He didn't care about the paranormal activity, or what the dragon was meant to do. He cursed whoever was in control of always taking Yuta away from him. The door of the classroom, Mr. Stevenson came out of swung open once more, but Carter didn't care to look up. "There you are, Yuta. Thanks for helping me out, Mr. Stevenson said, patting the black-haired boy's back. Carter instantly jolted his head up and widened his eyes. "Yuta, where were you?" "I was looking for you," Carter exclaimed, relief washing over him. His heart began beating normally again as he regained his stance, pulling Yuta in for a hug. Yuta solemnly nodded, his dark eyes cast to the floor. Carter pulled back and noticed that something was different about the boy. He was gripping a stack of papers with his left hand and his right arm dangled at his side, with his fist clenched. Carter couldn't pinpoint the exact emotion on his face, but it was something dark, that's for sure. A feeling of uneasiness rose in Carter as many dubious questions entered his mind. He wondered how Yuta was able to disappear out of seemingly thin air, and then emerge out of the classroom that was across from the pool room. Yuta was just helping me with carrying some of my heavy paperwork. What an excellent student you are, Yuta. Mr. Stevenson responded to him, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. Yuta flinched at Mr. Stevenson's touch and still did not dare to look into Carter's concerned eyes. I'll take it from here, Yuta. Thank you so much for your help, he exclaimed, grabbing the stack from Yuta's arm. Carter watched as Mr. Stevenson happily trotted past the destruction site, with a slight spring to his steps. He paid it no heed and returned to meet Yuta's gaze, who began walking the other way. Hey Yuta, is everything okay? You look, troubled. Was it because of the thing? I know the falling bricks were really scary, but I'm glad that you're okay. Also about the, kiss. Carter, Yuta sternly interrupted, clenching both of his fists and staring at the ground as they walked through the hall. Call a group meeting. Right now, he ordered, and judging by the taut tone of his voice, he was not going to take no for an answer. Of course, but we can only meet after school, remember? That's when room 110 is available. Plus, lunch is about to end and we can't just skip, Carter hesitantly pointed out. What happened to him? Yuta shook his head and twisted his neck to meet Carter's worried gaze. He wore a hardened expression and Carter was curious about the sudden shift in his behavior. This is urgent, Carter, he said in a deadpan voice. I need to tell you all something that must be said right now. Skipping class is the least of my worries. Carter's eyes glimpsed down at Yuta's clenched fist, and he noticed small droplets of blood dripping to the ground. What is it? He asked, swallowing the lump in his throat. He suppressed the urge to ask Yuta what happened to his hand, wanting to first find out about why the meeting needed to be called. The grim look Yuta gave him involuntarily caused Carter's body to heat up with nervousness as sweat trickled down the nape of his neck. Whatever his reason was didn't sound good. I can see the paranormal activity now. Carter widened his eyes and halted in his tracks. He gaped at Yuta as his heart pulsed rapidly and his breathing turned shaky and ragged. How did that happen? He squeaked, his mind suddenly devoid of all logic and reason. He was dumbfounded and blinked at Yuta, asking him to say what he didn't want to think was true. Yuta unclenched his fist, opening his right palm under Carter's nose so he could see it. Etched on his palm was the devil's mark. 3 lines connected to form a triangle. A thick line crossed through the middle. But it was not a simple and clean tattoo like the others. The symbol looked like it had been carved by the hands of an evil torturer. Someone had dug a knife in Yuta's palm and forcibly carved the mark. Blood seeped from his flayed skin and dripped down to the floor. It was the only sound that rang through the eerily empty hallway. The scars and cuts stretched past the palm of his hand, and red lines spiraled around the triangle, extending towards the tips of his fingers. The numbers 9346 were scrawled in bloody handwriting underneath the mark. Carter looked up at Yuta and stared straight into the dark abyss of his eyes. A sudden realization struck him. What if Yuta was the one who disappeared from the pool room himself, using supernatural powers? He was with him the entire time in the change room, so what if he conjured the dragon? Yuta could have easily been lying about not being able to see the dragon before. He could be lying about everything. About the mark that looked like he carved himself and suddenly being able to see the paranormal activity. Perhaps he lied and purposely did all this so he could disguise himself as a victim like the others. Yuta was the new kid in the small town of Willesden. He first started school on September 3, 1946. That's when the first paranormal activity experiences began. Carter desperately shook his head, although his nauseous gut told him otherwise. Perhaps Yuta didn't do it knowingly, but it might have happened because of the vulnerability of the moment. His right eye had the same triangular symbol to begin with, and that's where the shadow dragon seemed to have poured out of. Carter tried to rid his mind from the looming thought, in severe disbelief, but it crept back into him like a crawling insect, too stubborn to leave. Carter instinctively whispered his next words, his breath stuttering in his lungs before he exhaled, feeling the tension sear through his body. It's you, isn't it? You're the one.